What I love is that David's greatest moment came after he decided to serve his dad. But I think it's a really big deal. Sometimes I think just in our act of serving alone, those opportunities in the middle of that we would have never realized unless we said yes to the serving part. And I think it's just a side note that I want to make today as we journey through life because I think everybody in this room, if not, you will by the end of today, everybody in this room has this natural desire to change the world to some capacity. Whether it's your friend, your street, your city, your nation, or the universe, whatever it is, everybody's wired with that. And I think it's important as we wait for moments where it's like those tipping point, those where everything changes, the critical mass, all those moments that, hey, David just served his dad, and he stumbled upon the moment. And as we find out, David killed Goliath, which you would think would be kind of the stepping stone that would put you into the promise of being the king. But as we find out, it actually took David a whole different direction. So by the time you get to chapter 18, what Saul did is he actually brought David close to him. Saul's a pretty smart guy. I don't know, sometimes when we read the life of Saul, we think he was kind of dumb. He was king. He was a king for a reason. He was a good-looking man that actually knew what he was doing. And so Saul said, I want this kid on my team. I don't want to be on the opposite team from this kid. So he brought him close to him. But something happened in verse 6 of chapter 18. Let's read, I think it's through verse 9. Now it happened as they were coming home when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistines that the women had come out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. So the women sang as they danced and said, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Yeah, exactly. This song, by the time we get to chapter 21, we'll read it in just a little bit, this song went viral. It was the #1 downloaded song on iTunes and the top song on billboards. Why? Because the Philistines, the enemy, knew the song. We'll get to that in just a minute. So this wasn't just a little in-house song. This took over the airwaves, if you will, of that day. Like Saul can kill 1,000, David can kill 10,000. That became an anthem, if you will. It became a song to identify David's courageousness, his courage. Verse 8, then Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him, and he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000, and to me they have ascribed only 1,000. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? Verse 9. So Saul eyed David from that day forward. In other words, Saul became extremely suspicious of David. I was thinking about verse 8 last night. I was like, what would it have been like if Saul would have taken David under his wing and actually fathered him? We'd have a whole different story, we know that. I think it was an incredible example. We always talk about letting our children go beyond what we do. And then Saul had that opportunity, but Saul obviously didn't make a great decision. He got jealous and he got suspicious of David. So this is when Saul, his flip switch, he just became someone else. And as you read the Bible, you can see that things were building, and Saul has some issues. So it wasn't this moment, but he had some issues. But this was the one thing that kind of broke his back, if you will. And this is when Saul went down a road where the Lord actually departed from Saul. And it can be traced to almost to this moment right here. So now let's pick up in verse 12. Now Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed him from his presence and made him captain over 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. I often wonder if Saul removed David he knew David had the anointing, had the favor, had the goods, if you will, but he's like, I just can't be with them, but I got to keep them on my team. Verse 14, and David behaved wisely. I want you to underline that, or at least make a note about it. Behaved wisely in all his ways, and the Lord is with him. Therefore, when Saul saw that he behaved very wisely, he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before them. You don't have to turn there, but I had you make a note of behave wisely, and he behaved very wisely in verse 14 and 15. In Matthew chapter 13, I'll read it to you. In Matthew chapter 13, it's a very similar type of verse, verse 54. This is when Jesus is rejected at Nazareth. Verse 54, when he had come to his own country, he taught them in the synagogue so that they were astonished and said, "Where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works? Is this not the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary and his brother James, that guy, Simon and Judas? And his sisters, are they not all with us? Where then did this man get all these things?" Verse 57, so they were offended at him. And then if you go to Acts chapter 6, I can turn there for you. Acts chapter 6, another similar thing takes place. Acts chapter 6, verse 10. Now we're talking about Stephen. We'll read verse 8 actually, give you a little bit of an idea of what's going on here. And Stephen, full of faith and power, did great wonders and signs among the people. Then there arose some, from what is called the synagogue of the freedmen, Cyrenians, Alexandrians, and those from Cilicia and Asia, disputing with Stephen. Look at verse 10. And they were not able to resist the wisdom and the spirit by which he spoke. Now, as you continue to read, we find out that they kill Stephen. What's interesting to me is David, Jesus, and Stephen all experienced the other side of favor that we don't like to talk about. They experienced favor that didn't actually help them advance in the eyes of man. It actually regressed in the eyes of man. As we find out from David, that favor that he had, because he behaved very wisely, was hard for Saul, and so David became a fugitive. Jesus, as we find out, as we all know his story, is Jesus was very wise, and they're like, who is this guy? Where did he get all this? And because they couldn't reconcile it, because it violated everything about them, they were offended at him, which, as we know, began the course where they eventually murdered him. Stephen, same scenario. They're like, this guy, something is different about him. He walks in power and authority, and the words of wisdom that comes out of his mouth, they couldn't make sense of it. And then, as we find out in the rest of that chapter in Acts, is they killed him too. There's a kind of favor, and I don't know how to, I feel like it's important to mention, because sometimes in our life, as we act and live and do our stuff, sometimes we do things because of the favor on us, but it doesn't always mean that it will be well received. It's important. Why? Because there's two types of favor. There's favor with man and there's favor with God. They're both great. They're both good, and it's really nice when you have both of them going for you at once. What you don't want is favor with man and no favor with God. That's a bad scenario. It'll be fun for a while, but in the end, you'll regret it. And then there's favor with God. Why I think it's important to mention these three individuals, David, Jesus, and Stephen, is because sometimes in our life, we have favor. We know the word of the Lord in our life. There's an anointing, et cetera, et cetera. And as we go through life, sometimes it's not received well. What we can't do is question the favor we have based on man's reaction.